Hello everyone and welcome to a very special event in the Perron Institute's online discovery series, our inaugural webinar with the spotlight firmly on the condition multiple sclerosis. And we ask the question, are we on the verge of discovering its cause? This webinar is the first in a series which the Perron Institute will be making available to you over the coming months to share with you some of the innovative research that is being conducted at the Institute as we explore a range of different neurological diseases that the Institute is focusing on. Some of these include stroke, muscular dystrophy and neurotrauma. But as I mentioned, today multiple sclerosis is under the microscope, and in just a few short minutes I'm going to introduce you to our very special guest, Clinical Professor Allan Kermode. Before I do though, here's where you play a very important part in today's special event. Some of you may be very familiar with webinars, and for others this may be in fact the first time you've ever been involved. We want you to know that you are very much an important part of this event, because in these challenging times of being in a pandemic, we may not be able to have you with us in an actual room as a studio audience, but let me assure you that right now, as I speak to you, we are live on air, which means so are you. You'll be hearing the very latest expert information from our leading Australian specialist in MS. And importantly, you'll also have the opportunity to ask your questions. So, how do you send in those questions? All you need to do is simply go to the open question area at the very bottom of your screen and you can follow the prompts. Now, those questions, I must tell you that we don't necessarily get to during the webinar. We will do our very best to give you written responses right after the webinar. And now, let me introduce you to Clinical Professor Allan Kermode, who is, of course, familiar to many of you because he's both a researcher and a clinician at the Perron Institute. And it is wonderful to have you here. Allan Kermode, so great to have you with us today.
Thank you, Tina.
It's great to have you here for this inaugural event. And for those of you who don't know actually the extent and the depth of Allan's expertise in the world of MS, let me tell you a little bit about him. Allan graduated from the University of Western Australia. He was fellow at the Royal Australasian College of Physicians, the Royal College of Physicians, London, worked in the Oxford University Department of Neurology and the Institute of Molecular Medicine, Oxford, the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery, Queen Square, London, and in the National Institutes of Health in the United States. The recipient of so many postgraduate awards, he's the former head of the Department of Neurology and Clinical Neurophysiology at Sir Charles Gairdner Hospital. Also this is the Institute of Immunology and Infectious Diseases at Murdoch University and private clinics, as well as the director of the Demyelinating Diseases Centre at the Perron Institute. And I know, Allan, that's not even half of your expertise and the depth, of course, you've got in your career. But it is wonderful to have you with us. What I find really interesting, what's compelling, is that in the many years that you've been conducting multiple sclerosis drug trials, you've established also the comprehensive Western Australian clinical database of over something like 2,000, is that right, MS patients?
Yes, that's right.
With comprehensive long-term follow-up. So with that as a backdrop, let's get straight to the headline that features in the title of today's topic, and that is, are we close to finding the cause of the most disabling disease of the central nervous system? Are we close?
Thank you, Tina. I believe we are close, and it's important to emphasise that this is built on the shoulders of the work of many hundreds, if not thousands, of researchers in this area around the world who've collaborated, shared information, made sacrifices to bring our science to the current level. Moreover, it's important to acknowledge, especially to patients who have multiple sclerosis, that their engagement in research has also been preeminent and important because if we take just here in Western Australia, it has been my experience that MS patients and their families in general are very supportive of research, and they are usually very keen to engage in research and, for example, agree to give blood or help in any way that they can. just for themselves, but unselfishly, because they do not want other people to experience the same disease that they've had.
I know, Allan, that your research is so varied, and it's interesting, isn't it? But so many people don't understand how complex MS really is. So many components. You were saying to me earlier that there are over 250 genes known to play a part in MS. What, in your mind, is the major machinery in the body that is responsible?
That is a very good question. And the current evidence and consensus is that MS is a result of an aberrant or maladaptive change in our immune system, which the immune cells can migrate to the nervous system, and that comprises the brain and the spinal cord, and inflammation occurs within the brain and spinal cord. And that results in injury. Now, the human body does have some capacity for repair from injury. However, repeated injury will ultimately result in impairments. And it is those impairments that then are experienced as symptoms by the individual sufferers of multiple sclerosis. And indeed, the symptoms they may experience can be as varied as the function of the immune system itself, the nervous system itself, I mean. It could be something as simple as changes in vision or tingling or numbness, or it could be clumsiness or incoordination. It could affect other important functions that we take for granted, things like our energy levels and fatigue, or even simple things like going to the bathroom can be affected by this illness. It's also important to emphasise that it can affect people in entirely different ways, and therefore one individual's experience of the illness may be quite different to another's. This variability and often fluctuation in the illness is one of the things which has made it very difficult to study. It's also the fact that the brain is relatively inaccessible, being inside the skull, which obviously is something we don't want to mess with if we can avoid it. It's not simple for us to take a sample of brain. Because of the mere function of the brain, you can't just take pieces of it to study like you can with a blood test if you were, for example, examining a blood disorder. So there are many challenges. An extra challenge, of course, is that MS is a lifelong disease. It can take a long time for symptoms to be experienced, and even a long time for it to be correctly diagnosed.
Was it true, you were saying to me earlier a bit about the fact that the gene that you talk about is present in 1 in 3 people?
Yes, so what we are talking about now is the risk factors, and we know from many genetic studies, which have been extremely useful, the areas of the human body and immune system which we need to be studying. I do want to make it clear to people listening to this, however, that technically MS is not a genetic disease. You do not inherit it from someone and you do not pass it on. However, these genes affect risk, and it appears to be the case that individuals with a European origin are somewhat higher risk than individuals who may have been their ancestors may have come from a different area of the world, such as East Asia. However, people in East Asia can get MS, as can Europeans. So everyone is at risk. If we look at the most common gene, which has the somewhat awkward name, HLA-DRB1*1501, this is an extremely common gene in Anglo-Celtic people. So yes, approximately 1 in 3 people that are currently living in Australia would carry this gene. But only a tiny fraction of those people with that gene are ever going to develop multiple sclerosis.
Fascinating.
If I use as an analogy, me as an individual, there's some risk of me experiencing skin cancer. And that's because not only might my skin be more fair than someone else's, but the environment plays a very big part, but then there's luck. So the biggest risk for a given individual of experiencing multiple sclerosis as an illness is indeed luck. But your statistical risk is modulated by your genetic makeup, your childhood illnesses you may have had, and a number of other environmental factors which have assisted us in where to focus our energy in studying this disease.
Very interesting. We, of course, are asking any of you to please send in your questions. We'd be delighted to take them as we move, and we're just seeing this right now. We're seeing quite a number of questions coming through. Let's take one of the first questions that's come through, Allan. And is there a link between multiple sclerosis and motor neurone disease?
This is a very good question, and one which we get asked very frequently. There is not a direct medical link. However, it is easy to see why people might imagine there could be, because both illnesses can lead to weakness. With the way science has been converging, there are certainly lessons that researchers in each area can learn from the other, but the mechanism of illness in those two illnesses and their treatment is quite separate.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. We look forward to receiving all of your questions, so please do keep them coming. You mentioned just a few minutes ago, Allan, the fact of environmental triggers. What do we know are the environmental triggers? What's out there, what's well known that perhaps those who are new to multiple sclerosis should know?
Well, the most intriguing thing about the environment is just how different the prevalence of MS is around the world. It varies by more than 300 times between areas of the world where the risk is low to areas where the risk is high. And painstaking epidemiological research, that's the study of environment and people and migration, has demonstrated that if an individual moves from a low-risk area to a high-risk area, or a high-risk area to a low-risk area, they often carry the risk of disease based on where they spent the first 15 years of their life. Historically, studies were done on people who had migrated, for example, from the Netherlands to South Africa. In the tragedies of the Second World War, there were mass migrations of many people, and we were able to study many of those people. And more recently, in the 1990s specifically, a significant number of people migrated from Hong Kong to British Columbia, predominantly Vancouver. And Vancouver benefits from a fairly good healthcare system and one with a lot of experience in MS. And in just the last 20 years, there's been almost a precipitous tripling of risk in people living in Vancouver who've come from Hong Kong of ethnic Chinese origin and the risk of MS.
Wow.
And it is predominantly an increase in risk in females. So the environmental factors appear to be more important in females than males. And the risk of MS has increased significantly in many countries around the world in the last 30 years. But again, intriguingly, not all. Many of the Scandinavian countries, which had a fairly high prevalence of MS, their risk has plateaued and has not increased, and in some areas has even slightly reduced. Whereas in countries like Australia, there is a clear increase since the 1970s in Australia.
Is that right? For those who are new to MS or newly diagnosed with MS, what would you say is the very latest when we talk about the categories, of course, being relapsing, remitting versus primary progressive? What can you tell us about that?
Well, importantly, if someone were to be diagnosed in 2020, the situation can be far more optimistic than for people who were diagnosed earlier. When I began my career as a doctor, we had no therapies at all for MS, and it was 13 years before we had our first therapies, which was a great advance, but they did not work as well as we would have liked in everybody. and there was a significant burden of treatment and potential adverse effects, whereas now not only can we very effectively prevent people from having further attacks with therapy, but for the first time, people with primary progressive disease, people who have not experienced the classical attacks as described, we can now say we have therapies that can slow the progression of disease. There's still a lot more work to be done in that area, but we've opened a crack in the door and we know where we have to go. We have navigation to solve these next problems.
So talking about those current therapies, am I right in knowing that there are about a dozen therapies out there at the moment that are solid, robust therapies that are being used? What do we know about what is working extremely well out there from a clinician's point of view?
Yes, well, how we judge the efficacy of therapies is usually by direct comparison. One of the big confounders with MS is people can have an attack, and then with no therapy whatsoever, they can improve. If that individual undertakes some change in behaviour or decides they're going to eat more bananas, for example, they will improve, but they may have improved had they not eaten bananas. So the testing of therapies is a very unbiased and rigorous process. Particularly because we must balance efficacy against risk. So returning to your specific question, it's much easier for us to tell if a treatment is not working because we know they've developed new lesions or new symptoms. It's sometimes more difficult to tell if a treatment is working, particularly for an individual with MS, because what our current treatments do is they stop new lesions, new damage, new injury to the nervous system. For someone with MS, however, that does not necessarily mean that the symptom they might already have is going to go away. So they might not feel any different because they might still have some symptom. Let us say, hypothetically, blurred vision or something, and they may say, well, my eye hasn't changed, this treatment can't be working. But I would flip that backwards and say, well, it's working because you've not had another attack, and thank goodness the other eye has not had an attack. So sometimes there is a disconnect between patient expectation and what the neurologist can deliver. And unfortunately, we, except as neurologists, we have to listen carefully to what the patient is asking, because sometimes it may not be immediately apparent to us what the concern may be. So good communication with a neurologist, and to be able to put everything on the table, including for the neurologist, to be plain speaking with the patient is really fundamental to a good therapeutic relationship.
Yeah. We're getting so many great questions coming in. Thank you so much. Do keep bringing them in. We'll try and get through as many questions, of course, as we can. Allan, we've had a lot of questions around exciting therapies in the pipeline, therapies in the final stage of testing. Tell us a bit more about that. What's around the corner?
Well, there's a number of things. And if I just start with things which are imminent, there are new therapies currently going through the approval process. For example, one of our therapies which is already available for patients with relapsed and remitting disease is currently undergoing assessment by the Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme for funding in people with primary progressive disease. Similarly, there is a medication which is going through the same process, hoping to get funding to reduce what we call secondary progression. And secondary progression is people who may not be getting attacks, but they just slowly feel that they're deteriorating. You know, the neurologist might ask them, is there anything new? And they might say, well, I can't walk as far as I did last year. And the neurologist might actually be happy that there's no new spots on the MRI, but the question arises in the patient's mind, well, I'm still getting worse, what more can you do? Now, obviously, the neurologist wants to do everything they can, but not every therapy at present is fully funded. There are new therapies coming which work, like some of our infusion therapies, which people can give themselves a needle occasionally rather than go to a hospital for treatment. But importantly, and this is something which I believe is really exciting, is the really big question, how close are we to even understanding why it happens in the first place? Because this is the crucial question that needs to be asked and then answered. Because until we can answer the mechanism of why it begins in the first place, it's going to be challenging to have completely effective therapies for reducing these other issues like secondary progression. Some of secondary progression may literally be people simply aging normally and therefore being less able to compensate for the symptom they have.
So you've partially answered a very good question which a number of our viewers have written into. Would it be fair to say that if these treatments are indeed as good as you say they are and will be around the corner, that indeed finding a cure, finding that so-called holy grail may not be so important anymore? But of course you're saying to us now that it is, of course, very important still, working in the laboratories, putting effort, time and money into finding what is it that causes it.
Yes, because there are two ways of advancing science. One is the way we do 98% of the time, which is hard work, slow, many sacrifices, and incrementally things do improve. They gradually, bit by bit, get better and better. So the analogy there would be the internal combustion engine for the car. It is in some ways the same as the first Model T Ford that rolled off the production line. But of course we all know it's nothing like the Model T Ford because modern cars are incredible. But nevertheless, that was not a quantum leap. Science intermittently has big advances where something new is discovered and it dramatically changes the paradigm of how we manage things overnight. And a good example for that, and one which we should all be proud of here in Western Australia, for example, is of course the discovery of Helicobacter pylori as a cause of stomach ulcers.
Of course, yes.
Stomach ulcers remain a significant medical problem, but the management today is far more effective than it has been for the last 100 years, purely because a totally different strategy. And of course, some things which were done which were probably useless, like sending people for counselling because they're too stressed with a stomach ulcer. This is an infection, so we need to get to the root cause.
Another question, if a cure is found, one of our viewers writes in, can it help people retrospectively if they already have MS, or will it be too late for current sufferers?
This is a very good question. And I would answer this question in ways, what are our unmet needs in MS? If I actually start at the beginning and finish with that question about the people who've had MS for a long time, the first unmet need is, can we prevent this illness? Because there are people who we probably know who one day will develop multiple sclerosis. Is it possible to prevent people from getting multiple sclerosis? If we know the cause, the answer to that is going to be it's highly likely we're going to be able to prevent at least a significant chunk of those. And again, blowing the trumpet for Australian scientists, the Gardasil vaccine preventing cervical cancer. How many thousands of lives have been saved by this vaccination? Or indeed, our very own Australian Howard Florey with purifying penicillin, one of the 3 Nobel Prize winners for penicillin. So when big discoveries are made, it can change the world. Second, for people who already have the disease and are diagnosed early, there is no doubt our treatment will be more effective. unequivocally. And we expect these people to have normal lives, living as they see fit, facilitated by us solving disease. With people who've had MS for longer, discovering the cause can still help significantly. We still need to answer the question of secondary progression and primary progression. Clearly, the disease is not over in these people. They're still deteriorating. And at present, we have many hypotheses, but we don't know for sure the mechanism of why these people are getting worse. Finally, if we are able to rebuild the nervous system, to help people repair and regrow, and I must say this particular area of medicine is still in its infancy, but those strategies cannot be effective if we haven't stopped the primary disease from damaging.
Right.
It's quite possible, for example, if we put in cells to grow new myelin, those new nascent juvenile myelin-producing cells may even be more vulnerable to multiple sclerosis than the original adult myelin-producing cells. So there's a big risk if we just go in blindly like a bull in a china shop that we could make people worse. So it's definitely knowledge is power.
We have had a number of calls and people inquiring about lifestyle modifications. Let's talk about some of the things that we perhaps know can make a difference. Let's start with one that a lot of people have been writing into us about in the last few minutes, and that is vitamin D.
Yes, so vitamin D is something which has certainly been in the public eye, and many fantastic claims have been made for vitamin D. But what we can say for sure is vitamin D is part of our organism and general health. We know it's important for bones, and we know what the usual level in the bloodstream should be. So none of us should be deficient if we can help it. But that doesn't really answer the question, are larger amounts of vitamin D helpful? So the science at this point in time would say several things. First, it's inadvisable for anyone, including MS patients, to have low vitamin D. And second, by the same token, we should not have too much. Australia has attempted to answer this question in a number of ways. We here, with our own investigator-led study of ultraviolet on the effect on the immune system of MS, focus has been done. There is a study called Prevance, where low-dose supplementation, where this is an Australia-wide study to see if that can alter the disease. But again, this is a slow way because it takes several years. If we knew for sure,
Yes.
all of this would be accelerated. Plus, we would not be investing very valuable resources, personal resources, both patient and researcher, into arguably less productive areas of research or dead-end areas, and instead concentrate in more productive areas.
I get the sense that you tread very carefully around the vitamin D issue, do you?
Yes, because anything I say, I have to be 100% certain. So for us, gut feeling is taking too much of a risk. The pragmatic approach, however, with vitamin D is that we measure it and we make sure people have enough.
And how much is enough?
And,
we'd love to know what's the right range.
Interestingly, it varies quite a lot in terms of whether you get it from sunlight or dietary supplements or whatever. And it's important to remember that vitamin D is not one molecule. There's a whole family of biological active molecules. And finally, vitamin D is not a vitamin. It's a pro-hormone. But when it was called a vitamin, we didn't know that.
How come we didn't know this exactly?
No,
right.
we didn't know that. So, yes, I do recommend that my patients have adequate vitamin D, but the point is adequate. It is unequivocally a fact that if you grabbed 100 people with MS who's misbehaving versus 100 people with well-behaved MS, vitamin D levels are unequivocally lower in those people with misbehaving MS. However, from the scientific perspective, is that because whatever is making their MS misbehave also pushes their vitamin D down? Maybe it's a back-end problem affecting both of those pathways. To immediately conclude that one is the direct result of the other, we can't do until we prove that link. There are many errors made in science by linking two unrelated associations together.
Okay. Diet and exercise, still under the banner of lifestyle modifications. What do we know, Alan, about diet and exercise?
Well, the good news is we know quite a lot about diet and exercise, and it is certainly demonstrated that almost anything that is good for your general health is going to be good if you have MS. Being unhealthy, generally unhealthy, eating poorly, not exercising, being overweight is going to be harmful. Tobacco smoking particularly we know to be harmful, and it's been well demonstrated that people who smoke regularly have almost 4 times the risk of deteriorating than if people do not smoke. Now, diet, of course, is something which many people have different ideas about, and I can tell you in the last 35 years there's been many different diets people have proposed. There are many different kinds of healthy diet, and one kale salad won't make someone healthy, and one bucket of chips won't make someone unhealthy. So it is about balance. Now, there are many people who've promoted low-fat diets. There's an equal number of people who've promoted very high-fat diets, and they've each made the same claims. So the important thing is that people should not go on an extreme diet without carefully considering the implications on health that an extreme diet can do.
So on that matter, shouldn't we be spending more money on research looking at things like diet?
Well, I'm delighted to say that many people have been looking at diet, and in fact here in Western Australia there are researchers looking at what we call biomolecules, lipids, fats in the bloodstream, because we know in other creatures that these are the raw materials for myelin in the brain insulation. We also know from colleagues around the world looking at how the diet affects our microbiota, this is the organisms in our gut, that there's such a thing as an unhealthy microbiota and a healthy microbiota. But diversity of diet does appear to be important in maintaining gut health. Within Australia, various efforts have been done to look at diet, and certainly groups in the eastern states have looked at diet and specifically asked the question about fats, meats, etc. And that has been shown that in Australia it appears that a significant intake of unprocessed red meats reduces your risk of getting MS. Now, these are just statistical associations, and I'm not necessarily recommending everyone suddenly start putting more steak on their barbecue. The Canadians have studied this quite well, the Nurses Canadian Healthcare Study, where everyone that joined nursing as youngsters, may I use that word, in their teens and early 20s, were followed for over a quarter of a century.
Is that right?
And they looked at lifestyle prospectively, again in an unbiased fashion. So they didn't ask them to recall how much they used to eat. They followed them over that time. And we found support for some of the things we already know, like in many people being overweight can increase your risk of high blood pressure and diabetes. Smoking increases risk of stroke and heart attack. But they did not find a relationship between the risk of MS and how much fat you ate or how much meat you ate. But they did find low fibre increased the risk of bowel cancer. On this point, though, they also took blood. And again, intriguingly, they did find that on average, people who had a higher risk of MS did tend to have lower risk of lower levels of vitamin D in their blood, but also evidence for less effective immunity against a very important virus, Epstein-Barr virus,
Okay.
which, believe it or not, well over 90% of Australians have come into contact with.
I've heard about that. Yes.
And
yes.
99.9% of them are not going to get MS. But that appears to be one of the key environmental risks for MS.
That's such an interesting piece of the puzzle, isn't it? We're delighted that you're joining us here for our Discovery series at the Perron Institute. Of course, Clinical Professor Allan Kermode is with us. We're talking about multiple sclerosis. Alan, I should tell you, we've been getting so many great questions coming in. We're looking forward to fielding as many of those questions as possible. And of course, those that we don't get to during this webinar, and we're of course going through for 1 hour, we indeed will be writing and answering your questions in the next 24 hours. So we still have a bit of time. We will. I know you're going to be very busy in the next 24 hours. So let's now talk about something that has made the system in questions run absolutely hot at the moment. And we are talking about out-of-the-box treatments. And the out-of-the-box treatments that we hear so much about, not necessarily that come out of Australia, but come out of different countries. We're talking about Mexico, Russia from memory. So I'm going to name some of these things, and I would love you, Alan, to tell me your thoughts about these treatments. Number one, cannabis oil.
That is a very good question and also a very topical one. And there are many ways to answer this question. And I should add that my maternal grandfather's doctor's bag only had a few medicines in the bag, and there was opium, cocaine, hashish, but also strychnine and arsenic. Now, before you think that's too crazy, arsenic was actually a component of an antibiotic called salvarsan and was effective. So there is no doubt that cannabis plants contain many active pharmaceutical compounds, of which the two main dominant compounds can be divided into cannabidiol and THC, or the tetrahydrocannabinoids. And there's all different kinds of tetrahydrocannabinoids. So combination of those can be useful in different things. I'll put certain kinds of childhood epilepsy to one side, because that is an area like Dravet syndrome where those compounds can be useful, and come to an area where cannabinoids are most likely to be useful, and that is pain, neuropathic pain. They can be useful in management of pain, and cannabinoids in general are relatively safe. And they can also be useful to control spasms. Now, we do have other medications to control pain and spasms. My personal view is more choice is always a good thing, because a given treatment may not work in every patient. It's also true to say that cannabinoids are not helpful for pain in all patients, and some patients cannot take them. However, for other patients, they can be quite useful. Currently, there are many logistical, financial, and bureaucratic concerns we have with cannabinoids, but at least we're now at a stage where we have high quality pharmaceutical grade cannabinoids which can be properly tested, safely used, and I was going to use the word consumer, but I could get myself into trouble saying that, but where a patient where a patient can be reassured that if they're given a prescription, then they're getting exactly what's been prescribed, and that if they have dose X and it's helpful, that tomorrow, if they take dose X, it will also be helpful and not produce adverse effects. So, I would say there's various reasons why we reduced using cannabinoids in the 1950s and 1960s, because there are other options, and because of the difficulties with refining, we didn't have good cannabinoid options. So I think the background is there.
You're a clinician. Tell me how many of your patients turn up at your doorstep and say, Allan, I want to look at stem cell treatment in Mexico.
Well, some people do ask those questions, of course, and it's important here to explain that what different people mean or say about stem cell treatment, they're often meaning different things. And I would certainly say that the standard of medicine in Australia and other countries is very high, and someone who admittedly is desperate would wonder to themselves, why is this therapy being offered in the Philippines or Mexico and not somewhere famous like the Karolinska Institute in Sweden or the Perron Institute in Western Australia? Well, the truth is that certain kinds of chemotherapy are offered in these places, but they are niche treatments. If we talk about what is usually being offered, these places are not interested necessarily in diagnosing the people, and they do often make claims which are difficult to substantiate. And they offer chemotherapy, and what they're referring to as stem cells is blood stem cells. They're not brain or nervous system stem cells.
So make that clear, blood stem cells.
Blood stem cells.
Okay.
To repopulate the blood so that the chemotherapy is not too toxic. Those people who have relatives who've had chemotherapy for other diseases, such as lymphoma, would know what that comprises. And there are many risks of chemotherapy. Second, the cocktail of drugs that is given for the stem cell treatments usually offered in Mexico or Russia comprises one anti-CD20 monoclonal antibody, which is actually available for free here in the pharmaceutical benefits scheme and is one of our main infusion treatments. But we just don't give the other toxic chemotherapy drugs. There will always be a small group of MS patients who may require niche therapies, but they're best administered by people who know what they're doing and who get no financial benefit from giving such treatment. Finally, if someone has disability, blood stem cells are going to make no difference to disability. We know from studies which have been carefully done, including here in Perron Institute, where we've completed and published a study of stem cell therapy in progressive multiple sclerosis, and is that these therapies in the short term, in the first 12 months, accelerate brain shrinkage because they're toxic. So one has to weigh up, is the benefit going to outweigh the toxicity? We do not give these therapies because we're putting stem cells in the brain so that people can jump out of their wheelchair and be in the delayed Olympic Games. It simply doesn't work like that. For people with early MS, as I mentioned at the very beginning of this talk with bananas, if you have an attack, the natural history of your initial attack is to get better, whatever we do. So our treatment is focused always not only on now, but the future. We need to be looking 50 years ahead for the typical 20 or 30-year-old who presents. So evidence-based. You cannot just give a therapy and say, we give this therapy because you've paid us a lot of money. It has to be demonstrated to be more effective.
And you can understand the frustration for so many patients who have this glimmer of hope.
Of course, it is not just frustration. It is pain and suffering. You know, it is a desperation, and also one grieves for the health that they deserve. So I do understand that. But if these therapies were any kind of miracle as proposed, not only would our government be paying for it, they would make it compulsory over the other treatments, because having chemotherapy is actually a lot cheaper than many of these 12 therapies. And unfortunately, too often, I've seen people who have believed what they've been told and have either had profoundly adverse outcomes or no positive outcome other than remortgaging their house or funding what is an enterprise of dubious integrity.
We certainly have heard many cases like that. Another really good question that's come in from one of our viewers right now. Thank you very much for sending in your questions. We do still have some time, so please do fill in your questions. We'd love to get to it as much as we can over the next 10 minutes, 15 minutes that's remaining. There is a great question about the process of diagnosis for a child, Allan, with MS. What is that process?
Yes, this is another extremely good question. And I must apologise to everyone who's tuned into the webinar if I've got carried away on some of these answers, because I may try and be too precise on some of these answers when really we will need a broad brush approach. It can be very challenging diagnosis in a child. It's challenging enough in an adult, but children pose specific challenges for multiple reasons. One reason is that children can sometimes have an attack which we'd call a clinically isolated syndrome, which, to all intensive purposes, resembles an MS attack. But a percentage of those children will never, ever get ill again. So we hope, of course, for their sake, that that's going to be the case, but we can't be sure. So the spectrum in children is a little bit more diverse. Second, the commonest ages for people to be diagnosed with MS is between the ages of 20 and 40, but it can be diagnosed in any age, in people's 70s or even older, and of course in young children. The third reason it can be challenging is because, as we all know, children are pretty amazing and can adapt to almost anything and recover like we oldies are not able to if they injure themselves. So it may even be difficult for them to express what they're experiencing or even be aware they have a symptom. And the majority of the abnormalities we see on an MRI scan are asymptomatic. So, and the final challenge is we don't like doing any kind of uncomfortable or difficult test on children if we can avoid it.
Yes.
Because that alone can be counterproductive. As adults, it's a bit easier to explain what's going on and what we have to do. It's much more difficult to explain to a child. Fortunately, we do have paediatric neurologists who have, for want of a better term, very good perceptual abilities at studying and helping children. But it can often be a time-consuming process. I guess ultimately the thing to say is that the correct diagnosis will eventually be established, and that we need to balance delays in diagnosis against the risk of giving therapies which are not as well tested in children as they are in adults.
Right.
Most therapies are restricted in adults, and as the body's growing, its effects of a treatment may be quite different, say on an adult who's fully grown.
You've answered this in part, but it is worth indeed revisiting. Why isn't there a simple diagnostic tool like a blood test? And when, if at any time, are we looking to develop one?
This again is another very important question. It comes back to the cause of MS. It is an immune-mediated disease, but it's a disease that is behind the blood-brain barrier. It is contained within the nervous system. So whilst we have some quite non-specific biomarkers in the blood of brain injury, which are also there in head injury, for example, they're not useful in making the diagnosis. And that's because we literally do not know the primary cause. So this is a question of focus and commitment. And globally, internationally and locally, we now have the tools to tackle this important question, the preeminent question. What is the cause? What is the trigger? And once that can be identified, then we may be able to help with looking at the dysregulation of the immune system. But there's so much going on in the systemic immune system that finding the primary cause in MS is like looking for a key at the bottom of the ocean. And at the moment we can't even find an aircraft in the bottom of the Indian Ocean. So, and that should be a bit easier than what we've been doing with MS. But the brain is inaccessible. If we see a spot on the brain, we can't just take a sample and come back and say, we're not sure, can we take another biopsy? That's a non-starter in MS research.
Let's take a slightly different approach and ask a question about stigma for people living and journeying with MS, the stigma associated with the disease, especially young people who are diagnosed early in their careers. Are there ways neurologists can assist with this? And what are you currently doing in that area, in that space?
Knowledge is power, and stigma works both ways. Many times I've tried to put myself in the shoes of someone diagnosed with the disease. And an individual who has MS, we also need to make sure that they don't perceive that makes other people stigmatise against them. So they just happen to be an individual who's got MS. Whilst it's not possible to deny one has an illness, they can try not to let it define them. The neurologist is part of this process, I hope, by being able to answer a lot of the questions they have. Interestingly, some of the perceived stigma comes from things many people are not comfortable with discussing. Things like going to the bathroom, intimacy with their partner. Do they tell their children? Because I can tell you, most people diagnosed with MS have had a child, or sometimes they're just beginning their journey into adult life, just married, first child. And that can significantly throw a spanner in the works of how they see themselves. They may see themselves as less attractive to their partner. Now, that may not be the case at all, but that's something. But there needs to be good communication between the partner. The partner might be frightened of their partner's illness. They might even be frightened to be too intimate in case that they upset something or cause some problem. And so it is difficult to imagine how people might think. People do want to be empowered, but they also need to be evidence-based and realistic at what real empowerment is. And real empowerment is controlling the disease.
Yes.
So it's not a competition to see what you can and cannot do. Or not infrequently, we see people who say, I'm going to beat this disease by myself. I don't want medicine. And
what do you say to people and patients who come in saying that?
Well, I try and have empathy, of course, and try and understand why they feel that way about medicine in particular. Almost always it stems from a misunderstanding of what medicine means, how it's tested, what it does and why it's useful, and why I'd want my daughter or son to have it if they had MS. The only reason we give it is because it works.
I was going to say, do you take a strong stand when indeed there would be people, I'm sure, who would come to your clinic and say, no, I am, Professor, going to beat this without any one of the very good treatments that's available on the market right now? Do you ever take a strong stand and say, you cannot do what you're saying you're going to do?
My approach is always to be as honest as possible. And I will say, I think this is a very bad decision you're making. Sometimes, however, there are situations where the situation is not quite so black and white. You know, there are situations where it may be quite reasonable to defer a decision on therapy with the caveat that we closely monitor. But I try and understand how they've come to their conclusion. By the same token, even if they make that conclusion, doesn't mean that I wouldn't try and help them in other ways or help treat their symptoms. I would say the same thing to someone who's smoking 2 packets of cigarettes a day. I'd say that's a very bad decision. But it wouldn't mean I'd lock the door so they couldn't come back.
I'm delighted to know that there are a number of carers tuned in during the webinar. Thank you very much for joining us. We have got some questions around, what message would you give to carers, with that clinician hat on again, who don't always have the symptoms explained very well to them? What sort of advice would you give to carers who you don't often get to have that much contact with? And it's a challenge because MS, of course, doesn't just affect the patient. It affects the family, it affects the community, it affects the friends.
It does. And the first thing I'd like to say is thank you to all the carers, because all individuals, not just people with MS, can be extremely difficult at times. So, just being human beings and taking care of each other. Many symptoms people have with MS cannot be seen. If anyone has ever slept on their arm and it's tingling and numb and uncomfortable, that is a symptom someone with MS could have, but you can't see it. But it doesn't mean that it might not make that person short-tempered or irritable. It's been estimated in 2017 by a good study published by MS Research Australia that MS costs the Australian economy $1.75 billion per annum. Wow. That is a huge amount of money. It costs Australian society, and I'm only talking about dollars. I'm not even talking about the true cost, which is the human cost, more than diabetes mellitus. And the quality of life for people who are unfortunate enough to have severe MS can be worse than people with metastatic malignancy. So this is not just something which we can say, what are you worried about? This is a major public health issue. And as you've emphasised, Tina, it's not just the patient. This involves every member of that patient's family. Parents, children.
Allan, very, very quickly, our last couple of minutes, you've seen the worst and indeed the best in your many years of work with multiple sclerosis. Hand on heart, do you honestly believe that here in Western Australia, the work that's been done throughout many areas, and indeed right here at the Perron Institute, that we are getting meaningfully close, and I'll be careful how I say that, to a massive and game-changing breakthrough that will alter the way we view and indeed approach a diagnosis for multiple sclerosis?
I sincerely do, in terms of the key trigger and cause, because I've been working in this area, as you know, for 30 years in the United States, in Oxford, in London, in Heidelberg, in Germany, here. Perron Institute is part of a national and international network of hardworking, committed researchers in whom this is not just a job, it is a vocation. And there's, at the moment, a perfect synergy of technologies, knowledge, cooperation, and basic scientific research happening, which I believe we'll be able to crack this question.
It's very optimistic, very hopeful, and I'm delighted to hear those words from your mouth. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tina.
Professor Allan Kermode. Everyone, that concludes our webinar for today. Thank you so very much for being such an integral part of this discovery series at the Perron Institute. It's been wonderful that you could join us. Following this, of course, you'll receive an email from the Perron Institute with some more information regarding how you can indeed stay connected and importantly receive updates about future events and research as well. We want to let you know that a copy of this webinar will also be published on the Perron Institute website in the coming days. Thank you once again, Professor Allan Kermode. We
Tina.
so much appreciate your time. We love the fact that you've spoken to us in plain English. So thank you so much for really translating all of that important information to every single one of our guests who've joined us. Indeed, thank you for your company. We look forward to being able to bring you more in this discovery series. From me, Tina Altieri, and indeed our great guest, Professor Allan Kermode, thank you very much. Take care. We'll see you again shortly.
Thank you, Tina. Thank you.